Hi everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today we are going to be talking about the highly controversial Subculture palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills. Now this palette retails for $42 US, both online and in stores. It comes with 11 matte eyeshadows, 2 duochromes, and 1 metallic. But this one is so soft and buttery that it almost feels like a foiled eyeshadow. At first I thought it was, but it's not. It's just a really soft, buttery metallic. Now, I ordered the palette on July 25th, which was launch day on the Anastasia Beverly Hills website. I received a shipping confirmation or shipping notification on July 26th, and I actually had the palette in my hands on July 28th. So it didn't take very long whatsoever for me to actually have the palette in my hand. The shipping was phenomenal. I cannot complain about the shipping whatsoever. The packaging on this palette is very similar, or if not exactly the same, to that of the Modern Renaissance palette, which comes with like the really velvety, soft, smooth exterior, pretty sturdy. It comes with a mirror on the inside. I appreciate the fact that they've made this darker than this shade, because this one, as you can see, it got quite dirty over the time that I've had it. But I don't foresee it happening so much with this one since it is, like I mentioned, darker in color. The palette also comes with a dual-ended brush, but I really don't use this very much. It's not a bad brush. It's not an awful brush whatsoever. I used my Modern Renaissance brush quite a bit when I first received it. So it's not a bad brush by any means, but it's just not my most favorite brush to apply eyeshadows with. The color scheme on this is absolutely beautiful. I feel like you can get a lot of different looks within this one particular palette, and a lot of extremely different looks. So you can get a really cool toned look, or you can get a really warm toned look. It just depends on what you're feeling that day. Now, because of all the controversy that surrounded this palette pretty much off the bat, I decided to hold off on a review until I actually got to play with the palette for a full week. So that is exactly what I did. I tried to come up with a lot of different looks. I tried to incorporate a lot of the different shades within the palette. And now I feel like I have a better opinion of the palette as a whole now that I've used it for the entire week. So what do I think about the palette? I feel like I'm right in between. I've seen a lot of people either really, really love it or really, really hate it. Now, I don't love it and I don't necessarily hate it. That's why I consider myself to be right in between as far as the opinion on the palette goes. I feel like it took me a little while to get used to the palette and to actually figure out exactly how to use it, which in my opinion isn't very good. Like, if you're going to buy a palette, you just expect it to work right off the bat. You don't expect to have to work with it for a whole week or, even a few days for you to actually get like a good idea of how to work with the palette, how to apply the eyeshadows correctly, what to do, what not to do. Like, I feel like that's just not the way that it's supposed to work, but that's the way that it worked for me. I found myself initially liking it and I was like, yeah, this is going to be great. But then when I started playing around with more of the eyeshadows, applying them the way that I usually would, I wasn't such a big fan. It wasn't like the greatest experience, but only because of the different looks that I was coming up with and because of the ways that I apply eyeshadow onto my lids. For example, I was working on a more, deeper cranberry-ish type of a look. And when I went to apply All Star, which is this cranberry type of look right here, I went to apply that onto the entire lid, which is what I would typically do if I'm trying to, start out a smoky eye, or if I'm trying to create a smoky eye or anything like that. I packed the dark shadow. I mean, you all have seen me if you've seen any of my smoky eye tutorials. I packed the eyeshadow onto the lid and then I blended out around the edges. I found that does not work with this eyeshadow at all. What I was running into is that I was packing it on the lid, and then when I went to go try to blend it out, it wasn't a very pleasant experience whatsoever. It was quite frustrating because it wasn't blending out the way that a normal eyeshadow would, or the way that I would normally anticipate an eyeshadow to blend out. It was giving me a really harsh line around the outer perimeter of the mobile lid area. It was giving me a very obvious line. It was just really weird. It was a really weird experience. So what I had to learn to start doing with the palette is to gradually build that color intensity up and not go too heavy-handed right away, because that's when I felt that I had the toughest time with the palette, with blending any eyeshadow out, was when I went too heavy-handed right off the bat. You've got to go light. You've definitely got to go light. The eyeshadow palette overall, all of the matte shades have a ton of kick up. You're going to have a lot of kick up. They're not chalky, as I've heard a lot of people say. And I mean, maybe my definition of chalky is different from like the next person's. But when I think of chalky, I think of something that's like really dry and just not very pigmented and just kind of like it's not consistent with the way that it applies. I didn't have any of those issues. I found that the eyeshadows are actually really buttery. They're really creamy. They're extremely pigmented, which is what made them hard to work with for me. The fact that they are extremely pigmented. But I wouldn't consider the eyeshadows chalky whatsoever. Like, I remember when Jaclyn Hill collaborated with Becca on like an eyeshadow palette, those were chalky. The ones that I received, those were really chalky. I could not work with them whatsoever. I couldn't get good color payoff at all. It was just, they felt really dry. They just were not up my alley at all. But these are not like that at all. They're not dry. They're not patchy. At least I didn't feel that they were patchy. The only time that I experienced patchiness was when I went in too heavy-handed with the eyeshadow. Other than that, I haven't experienced any patchiness. Now that I know how to use it, which I hate to say, like, now that I realized and I learned how to use it, I hate the fact that there's even such a thing as like learning how to use an eyeshadow palette. But now that I know how to use it, I don't have any patchiness whatsoever. They're really good. When you go really heavy-handed with any of the eyeshadows that are matte, you are going to get a fallout. Quite a bit of it. So don't go heavy-handed with any of the eyeshadows. Try to do it really light. I mean, just a little bit goes a long way. I know that they keep saying that. I mean, if you follow them on their Insta stories or on the Snapchat, if you follow Anastasia Beverly Hills Cosmetics, they do say to go light-handed, and it is true. So for instance, New Wave, which is this orangey yellow shade. I barely tapped it, and there's so much. Like, I just pressed my brush to it. There's a lot of pigment on the brush already, and you get such good color payoff. Such good color payoff. Like, you don't really have to like dig your brush into it. These are really powdery, so you just need the lightest touch. You get a ton of color onto the brush, and then you get a lot of color onto the lid. You don't need to go really heavy-handed. These are very powdery. They are. There's no denying it. I mean, you can tell with just, you know, all the kick up that you get whenever you do go and press your brush in, but they are very pigmented. And the way that they achieved that was by not pressing these eyeshadows so much. So they're very lightly pressed, which makes them very loose. Like, it's not, you know, compacted together. So you do get some kick up because of how they are pressed, but you get a lot of pigment also for the exact same reason. Now, my thing with this whole controversy that I was like, what the heck, why is everybody losing their minds, is that the Modern Renaissance palette was such a hit. It was such a hit. It's still one of my staple palettes. Like, it's one of my go-to whenever I want something really quick and easy. And I've had this palette for quite a while now, and it's still one of my favorite palettes, all-time favorite. But the matte eyeshadows within this palette are pretty similar to these. They're not similar in formula, but they're similar in the kick up. They're similar in the color payoff. I just don't understand like why everybody's losing their minds over the subculture when, I mean, just to give you a little bit of an example here, I'll give you guys a close-up, but golden ochre here, I mean, like, look at all that fallout, right? But it is such a beautiful shade that you're like, well, whatever. And then there's burnt orange, which is the same. Like, I mean, you see a little bit of fallout, quite a bit actually. And then like raw sienna, it's exactly the same. I don't think that these are pressed as lightly as the other ones. I feel like the blendability is there. A lot of people were complaining about the powderiness. But if you want amazing color payoff, then this is kind of like the price we have to pay. Like, the eyeshadows are going to be soft and they're going to be quite powdery because they are so soft. So you just have to be gentle with them. Okay, now let's get into the swatches. So I'm going to start from the top row, left to right. First up is Cube. Now this is described as being a duochrome pink pearl. It definitely is duochrome. I find it to be very iridescent when you actually apply it onto the lid. However, it is very hard to apply onto the lid, as you can see, both with a finger and a brush. It's not very noticeable. Next is Dawn. This is described as being an ultra matte sand. Really beautiful shade. This is something that I've been popping all over my lid or just using as a transition shade. Next is Destiny, which is described as being an ultra matte sage green. Oh, I love this shade. I cannot live without this shade now that I have it in a palette. Next is Adorn. This one is the metallic bronze. So this is the only metallic within the entire palette. I feel like it acts more like a foiled eyeshadow, but I'm not complaining. Beautiful shade. Next is All Star. This one is described as being an ultra matte vintage wine. I find that a little bit goes a long way with this one, and you definitely need to build up the color intensity on that one. Next is Mercury, which is an ultra matte slate gray. Next is Axis, which is described as being an ultra matte blue green, another shade within a palette that I've never seen before. Personally, I love the fact that they threw something so different in here because it works so well with the purples and the oranges and the yellows and the greens and the browns. It just works really well with everything else that's in here. Now for the bottom row, starting off with Roxy. This one is described as being an ultra matte muted coral. Beautiful shade that I can absolutely see myself wearing, especially during the summer months. So like tropical looking. Next is Electric, which is the other duochrome lime gold. Now for the electric shade and for the cube shade, since you can see they're not very good with a dry brush, nor are they very good with a finger, I definitely recommend using them with a wet brush. Color payoff is so amazing. Next one is Fudge. This one is described as being an ultra matte warm bronze, and I think the name pretty much describes this shadow to a T. Next is New Wave. This one is an ultra matte citron orange. Goes beautifully with a ton of different shadows within this palette. Then we have Untamed. This one is an ultra matte tarnish green, which complements the New Wave shade a ton. I absolutely want to put those two together. Next is Edge, which is an ultra matte gold mustard. And last but not least is Rowdy, which is an ultra matte blackened purple. So my overall thoughts on this palette are that it is not for everyone. This palette is definitely not for everyone, and it definitely takes some getting used to, but I do find it to be very similar to the Modern Renaissance palette. It just doesn't have a ton of warm shades like that one did. This one has a lot more pops of color. It has a lot more shades that you wouldn't typically see within an eyeshadow, which is, I'm sure, what they were going for, to be completely different than anything else that's out there, which I feel they achieved. I mean, I can't personally think of even one palette that somewhat resembles Subculture. It's like completely different from anything else that I've seen. I definitely don't think that this is going to be a staple for me, just simply because of the eyeshadows. Like, the thing that drew me to the palette is the thing that's going to keep me from it being a staple. I still find that I'm going to favor my Modern Renaissance a little bit more, just simply because I am more of a warm toned girl, but I absolutely wanted to try the Subculture palette because it has a lot of the eyeshadows that you don't typically see within a palette. And that is pretty much all that I have on this palette. Those are my thoughts. Aside from that, one thing that I would suggest is that if you're on the fence about this palette, definitely go into an Ulta, go into a Sephora before you commit. And once you commit, always keep in mind that you can return it. You can absolutely return it. Get your money back, girl. If you don't like it, you take it right back. Because those are hard-earned $42, and if you do not wish to keep it, if you don't feel like this is going to work out for you, if you feel that the product is just too hard to work with, return it. Like, definitely return it. I am going to keep mine just simply because I like it. I like the fact that I have another palette that allows me to create very different looks with it, because the shades are very different from anything else that I have. But like I said, if you purchase it, if you have purchased it, if you think about purchasing it and you do purchase it and you don't like it, return it. So that is it. That concludes this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I truly hope that you enjoyed this video review and that you found it helpful. As always, take care, and I will see you all in my next video. Mwah! Bye.